My name is Nathalie Kermoal. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Native Studies, as well as the director of the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research. I would like first to welcome to the live stream format of the fall 2020 MÉTIS Talks. So I will start with land acknowledgement. The University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional gathering place for Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. We are presenting today a very special edition of MÉTIS Talks. We're doing it in collaboration with the Gabriel Dumont Institute, and we thought that we would reach towards the other side of the Métis homeland. And the Gabriel Dumont Institute is located in Saskatchewan, which is also located in Treaty 6 territory. And as I said earlier, is part of the Métis homeland. So some of you may not know what the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research does. So we have a number of affiliations. RCMR is, we call it usually RCMR. RCMR is a joint venture between the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Rupertsland Institute for Métis Excellence, known also as RLI, the Faculty of Native Studies, and the University of Alberta. The Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research is housed in the Faculty of Native Studies and is an academic research program specifically geared towards Métis issues. And in 2021, in the spring of 2021, we will be celebrating our 10-year anniversary. So for that, we'll have a series of different activities. And of course, we'll let you know when those activities are up and running. The goal and objectives of RCMR include building provincial and national connections with the Métis community, increasing research capacity to advance Métis-specific research, and training and employing student researchers. MÉTIS Talks are a semi-annual public event in the fall and spring that highlights Métis-specific research, art, and culture. So today, because of COVID-19, our session is an online session. And so you can watch us through Facebook and YouTube. And I was told by Amanda, who's helping and who is the coordinator of the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research, that if there was any interruption, which can happen, don't worry and don't panic, because we will upload a video of the MÉTIS Talks after this presentation. And these will be available on the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research Facebook page, but also on our website. And the same for the Gabriel Dumont Institute. So today, the way we are going to do things is we are going to start with Dr. Allyson Stevenson, and then we will move to David Morin, but Darren Prefontaine will present David Morin. And after each talk, we will have 15 minutes for questions. So you can send your questions at any moment. And we have two wonderful students that agreed to help us for this. We have Leah Hertzen, who is a PhD student at the Faculty of Native Studies, and as well as Devin Drossel, who is master's student in the Faculty of Native Studies. So Dr. Allyson Stevenson is going to start doing the MÉTIS Talks. She is a Métis Assistant Professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies and the Gabriel Dumont Institute Research Chair in Métis Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. She received her MA and PhD in history from the University of Saskatchewan. She is an adoptee from Kinistino, Saskatchewan, raised in Regina. Her research focuses on the 60s coup and the emergence of the Adopt Indian and Métis program. And we've heard through the grapevine that her book is coming up very, very soon. And her book, Intimate Integration, A History of the 60s Scoop and the Colonization of Indigenous Kinship, is forthcoming with the University of Toronto Press. And if I'm not mistaken, it's happening, at the end of the month. So stay tuned on this. She has published many articles on the 60s scoop, Indigenous women's political activism, and histories of Métis resilience and resistance. So her presentation title is From Rehabilitating Métis Families to Removing Métis Children, the Long 60s Scoop in Saskatchewan. So welcome, Allyson.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. It's my pleasure to be here to speak about my research today. And I really appreciate the invitation from the Rupertsland Centre for Métis Research to talk about the 60s scoop today on MÉTIS Talks. So everyone, you can hear me okay? Good, okay. So I'm just gonna pull up my PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared for today. Is everyone able to see that? Yeah, good. Okay, so my focus today is on the distinctive Métis experience of the 60s scoop in Saskatchewan. That's going to be drawn from chapters 3 and 4 of my upcoming book, as Dr. Kermoal mentioned, Intimate Integration, coming out at the end of this month. Well, the book looks at both First Nations and Métis experiences. The Métis experience begins well before the 1960s, which is why I refer to it as the long 60s scoop for this talk. I want to begin by acknowledging the land where I live and work and I raise my family, which is Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland in what is known today as the rural municipality of Flett Springs, Saskatchewan. I'm, as I said, Métis from Saskatchewan, adopted in 1976 and raised in Regina. Although I don't consider myself someone who was scooped. My family of origin is from Kinistino, and I reconnected with them when I was 20 years old. On my birth father's side, my Métis family is the Anglo-Métis Fiddler family from Red River, who moved later to the river lots of Prince Albert, and then to Flett Springs, where I now live with my family, as well as the Saskatchewan River Anglo-Métis family of the Cumberland House, Glen Mary Métis community through the Sixties and Umferville families. So I began my research into the 60s scoop in 2007 for my PhD in history at the University of Saskatchewan, where there was very limited understanding of the extent of the scoop. That was the year that Dr. Raven Sinclair completed her PhD, All My Relations, Native Transracial Adoption, a Critical Case Study of Cultural Identity, a foundational work in the 60s scoop. In the interim, a national class action lawsuit for the loss of culture of the 60s scoop has been settled, one that notably left out Métis people. Likewise, several provinces, Alberta included, have offered apologies for the long-term harms inflicted on children, families, and communities from the removal, adoption, and fostering of Indigenous children in non-Indigenous homes. My interest at the outset was firstly to determine the impact of adoption policies on Indigenous kinship, and secondly, to understand the policy origins of the 60s scoop. I sought to generate an Indigenous history of the 60s scoop while interrogating the meaning and significance of child removal for Indigenous nations. I want to begin with a story shared with me by Robert Doucette, who was president of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan at the time, as I was doing my research for my PhD dissertation. He is a survivor of the 60s scoop, originally from Buffalo Narrows in northwestern Saskatchewan, who was removed from his family in 1962. He grew up in a non-native foster home in Prince Albert and has become a prominent advocate for 60s scoop survivors. In the interview, I asked him about the significance of Métis kinship, and he told me, "It plays a huge role about your identity and how you end up where you are. If you're strong in the belief and knowledge of where you are and who you are." My grandfather was one of the founders of Buffalo Narrows, was a justice of the peace for 20 years, and had a huge library in the middle of northern Saskatchewan bush, 40s and 50s. He represented people in court. I didn't know that growing up. As a matter of fact, doing research, I come across pictures of him every now and then, and I usually shed a tear when I see a picture of him. One day, I was in the archives and I found a picture of him with a caption that reads, "Happy Métis grandfather with his 13 grandchildren, except one." I started bawling, and the archivist came there and asked, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, it's kind of sad crying and happy crying, because I finally got to see who my grandfather was, a picture of him. And there were all my uncles and aunties, just little kids." And so, you know, when you find pictures like that, it's kind of sad because I never met the guy. And I was told when they were taking me away in the car, my mushum was swearing in 4 languages and throwing rocks at the car. All through his life, he would ask his daughters and relations to find his little man. He just wanted to see him once. And it was the priest that took me, the priest that told social services my mother wasn't fit. She was too young. She was 16 or 17, and they came and they took me for no good reason. Because, you know, all about extended families in Aboriginal communities. It's not just one person. But that didn't happen in the 60s. They took all of us. Well, they took a lot of us. I was 4 months old when they took me. I was told I arrived in Duck Lake. I had just a diaper, some blankets, and a bottle. I was just a big kid, a chubby little kid, not much else. So when you look at kinship or where you come from, it has a huge impact on how you view yourself. Knowing those things about my grandfather and my mother, they're all doing quite well. Brenda McDougall's important work, One of the Family, Métis Culture in 19th Century Northwestern Saskatchewan, provides important insights into what Robert Doucette's oral history of his removal story captures. Set in the same region that Robert was removed from, she states, "What makes the Northwest truly compelling is that it is home to one of the oldest and culturally homogenous Métis communities in Western Canada, a community of people who grounded themselves in the lands of their Cree and Dene grandmothers by adhering to a way of being embodied in the protocols of Wokotwin. Wokotwin, a worldview that privileged relationships to land, people, and creatures that inhabited the space." As she states, quote, "Identity in this conceptualization is inseparable from land, home, community, and family. They are all one and the same." I wanted to begin this presentation with a Métis story and a Métis idea, Wokotwin, that helps ground the history of child removal and its meaning for the Métis children removed and the communities they left. Doucette's story in part captures the outcome of the intrusion of Euro-Canadian social workers into Métis families in Buffalo Narrows, but similar intrusions were replicated across countless other communities in Saskatchewan and Canada. This talk will focus on the historically specific policies that activated Métis child removal in the competing logics at work in Métis policy that saw integration of Métis children in the child welfare system in earnest by the early 1960s. I situate the origin of the long 60s scoop for Métis in Saskatchewan in 1944. When the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, came to power, and then gained momentum after 1961, or 1962, when the CCF formally ended its Métis colony policies. In this period, the Social Democratic CCF government in Saskatchewan undertook a shift in Métis policy from one that was premised on racial difference to that of colorblind integration, one that sought firstly to rehabilitate Métis families, to one that removed and relocated Métis children. The competing logics at work in this undertaking came about initially in response to settler demands for the removal of Métis presence in their midst, followed by the application of the CCF's distinctive ethos of rationalizing and individualizing Métis peoples. By analyzing Premier Tommy Douglas's Métis removal and relocation policies, one can witness a sequence of overlapping and conflicting logics at work, culminating in the paradigm shift that led to the 60s scoop. This era is a critical chapter in the history of social work, when Canadian society moved from embracing eugenic solutions to social problems to behavioral rehabilitation through social welfare. In Saskatchewan, I argue that the CCF government drew inspiration from Tommy Douglas's master's thesis in sociology, The Problems of the Subnormal Family, to create a government-directed relocation policy aimed at rehabilitating Métis families through inculcating Euro-Canadian values of the patriarchal nuclear family, proper gender roles, and thrift. The modernist efforts to socially engineer Métis peoples to embrace the values of middle-class Canadians successfully recast their political efforts to secure a land base as a welfare problem in need of a welfare solution. The term rehabilitation was employed by CCF officials to describe the process by which Métis people would come to embrace the value system of surrounding Canadian settler communities and cease to require government assistance and support. After the Second World War, there was a renewed interest in resource development and government intervention, particularly in northern Saskatchewan, which led to fundamental changes in the Indigenous fur and fishing economy. This tension led what one observer termed a confused and turbulent contact zone. The primary outcome was family breakdown and intergenerational conflict. In southern Saskatchewan, failed script policies, racism and poverty pushed Métis into a tenuous existence dependent on seasonal employment and government relief. In the early 20th century, many Métis families had moved on to road allowances. Communities such as Lestock, Glen Mary, Round Prairie, and others provided Métis peoples the last culturally meaningful community available after settlement of the Western Prairies. Rehabilitation sought to educate Métis families to adopt the work ethic, dress, language, land tenure, aspirations, family structure, and political outlook of the majority of the Anglo-Canadian Saskatchewan residents. In Walking in Indian Moccasins, Laurie Barron argues that the CCF recognized the collective identity of political organizations, whether farmer, native group, and were sympathetic to aims of the group. Barron believes that, quote, concern for the Native community was generated both by the administrative dictates of the day and by a socialist philosophy predicated on the notion of government assistance to the disadvantaged, end quote. In it, he argues that CCF Saskatchewan politicians and bureaucrats saw problems faced by Métis and First Nations as similar, stemming from the belief that poverty and marginalization could be overcome through reform and rehabilitation that would lead to integration into provincial services. In a previous article, Barron focused on the brief development of the Métis farm colonies in Willowbranch, Lebret, and Green Lake. In attempting to explain the logic of establishing Métis colonies, Barron refers back to the CCF social gospel base that is, quote, premised on the doctrine of love, and it proclaims the sanctity of cooperation as opposed to competition. Hence, it represents an explicit rejection of the, quote, survival of the fittest ethos. As part of the Métis rehabilitation policies, colonies, like First Nations reserves, would enable the Métis to generally assimilate and become competitive in mainstream society, in the thinking of the CCF, according to Barron. The colonies were intended to be temporary, perhaps one generation, while in actual fact, they lasted little over a decade. With schooling and farm instruction, cooperatives, and oversight, colonies were meant to enable the Métis to develop the necessary skills and competencies to enter non-Native society. Inherited from the Patterson government, the Liberal government prior to the CCF, they were under the direction of the Department of Social Welfare and Rehabilitation, and eventually abandoned in 1962 as a viable response to Métis integration, after which the government sought to integrate Métis people individually as they became part of the urban landscape. Unlike Barron, I see a less benevolent origin for Métis colonies in Saskatchewan, one rooted on denying the political agency of Métis people and arising out of the settler colonial objective of Indigenous elimination. In fact, one can see an early template for Métis colony scheme outlined in Douglas's final chapter of his master's thesis, The Problems of the Subnormal Family. After his invasive surveys and moralistic evaluations of the urban poor, Douglas posits a new role for the state in rehabilitating families to embrace the values of majority society, assisted by the churches. The responsibility for the state was expanding. Douglas stated, quote, "Since the state has the problem of legislating in the best interest of society, and since we have seen that the subnormal family is an ever-increasing menace, physically, mentally, and morally, to say nothing of a constantly rising expense, it is surely the duty of the state to meet this problem," end quote. Firstly, he proposed the improvement of existing marital laws. Secondly, developing a policy of segregation. And thirdly, sterilization of the unfit and an increased knowledge of birth control. Douglas was primarily interested in social segregation, locating this class elsewhere where the physical, mental, and moral effects would no longer affect the community. He claimed that, quote, "There can be little doubt that this group exercise an influence that is detrimental and we'd be best removed by segregating them." Men who were able to work but lacked initiative could be placed on state farms or colonies where decisions could be made for them by a competent supervisor, where their buying could be done for them. Douglas felt that, quote, "With proper supervision, the women could become better housewives and better managers of family finance," end quote. This treatise on the potential for the state to rehabilitate, quote unquote, subnormal contains a great deal of interest in moral and gender rehabilitation. Unlike earlier periods, when the state looked to churches or private charities to effect the work of moral regeneration, Douglas envisioned and then enacted a regime directed by social welfare experts where subjectivities could be refashioned to fit into settler communities by embracing the same, quote, living standards and moral standards that were expected of citizens. Through the colony schemes and rehabilitation policies, the state attempted to bring about the moral regulation of Métis families regarding reproduction and gender roles. According to scholar Mariana Valverde, quote, "Moral regulation was an important aspect of ruling, helping to constitute class, gender, and sexual and race relations by interpreting both social action and individual identity as fundamentally ethical." Tommy Douglas, as a progressive reformer, embraced the opportunity to employ his rehabilitation strategy once he became premier, overlooking such complexities as longstanding issues of land loss, race, and the complicity of surrounding white communities in the economic marginalization of Métis families. And so here's a map that was created by colleague Cheryl Troop just to demonstrate the removals of the road allowance communities. So Métis communities of Glen Mary, Punachai, and Belgenny were relocated to Green Lake, a Métis farming colony established under the Liberal Patterson government in 1940. Métis elder Henry Peltier was married and working at the time of the relocation and recalled the promise of 40 acres, assistance in setting up farms, and relief to live on while they were able to clear the land. His father had been told by the municipal councillor, Henry, quote, "Oh, going over there isn't going to cost you nothing. All right." Then as he said it, we were loading up there and we seen the smoke. That was the Chicago outfit. The house was a little shack. Well, they had some pretty fair shack lumber. There were quite a few houses. They had some pretty fair shacks. They were log houses with lumber roofs and good floors. They were fit to live in. That's where we lived at the time. We didn't even leave Lestock. There was great big smoke and them houses were burned. Now who the hell got paid to go and do that? Métis homes were burned while the people destined for Green Lake were still at the railway station, waiting to be loaded onto railway cars for relocation to ensure that families could not return to their former communities if they chose to leave Green Lake. The Saskatchewan public was either oblivious to the methods used to relocate the Métis or unconcerned, but were likely satisfied to read the government had undertaken a paternalistic assimilation scheme. In the article, Experiment with Métis, Punachai Settlers Did Not Stay Long, Children's Home Opened, where this image is taken from, depicted Green Lake as a contemporary contact zone reflecting a liminal space that required the proper government guidance in order to emerge fully modernized and integrated into the provincial economy and society. The author stated, Green Lake hangs precariously in a socio-economic balance between a fur trade past and a frontier agricultural potential. The images in the article provided reassuring images of progress. Happy children stood in front of the newly built children's shelter, smiling in one picture. In another, a principal stood proudly in front of the newly constructed schoolhouse. Another picture presented the church, and another a relatively impressive government building. The three agents of modernization, the state, the school, and the church would provide the necessary direction to ensure the Métis future, to ensure Métis rehabilitation. These photos also represent Douglas's agents of intervention to correct the sociological problems of the subnormal family, the church, the state, and the school. The government relocated 21 Métis families from the Punachai area and eventually several other Métis communities across the province to Green Lake by 1949. According to the article, the Métis families have been squatting on road allowances without economic facilities or much hope for the future. They were given 40 acres of land at Green Lake, with much of it cultivable, with the option of 40 more acres. It was stated in the article, whatever the reason, of the 21 families, 6 remain. The troubling fact of the missing Métis did not seem to dampen enthusiasm for the project. When asked about where the majority of the families had gone, the Deputy Minister of Social Welfare and Rehabilitation replied, "Where have the other 15 families gone? We don't know, though some of them did head back for Punachai." The messages printed in the Saskatchewan paper were intended to be positive. The CCF government demonstrated that it was addressing concerns that had been raised about the condition of the Métis by members of the public and municipalities. Simultaneously, the Department of Social Welfare and Rehabilitation opened the first non-denominational child welfare institution specifically for Métis children. On September 29, 1949, the article detailed the official opening of the Green Lake Children's Shelter for orphaned and neglected Métis children. It had been built in 1947 to care for up to 50 children and employed 14 staff members. The article captured the words of Minister of Social Welfare and Rehabilitation, John Sturdy, who spoke of the long-term goals for the children. Quote, "In dealing with the rehabilitation of the Métis, they should have pride in their ancestry. It is hoped that all these children will eventually be placed in foster homes, or after reaching the age of 16, will also be able to take their place in society." In 1944, the Department of Social Welfare took over responsibility for the Child Welfare Branch, replacing the former Department of Reconstruction, Labor, and Public Works. One of the first projects of the newly reorganized department was planning for a children's shelter at the Métis settlement of Green Lake to, quote, "give proper care and training to upwards of 50 children who are either illegitimate or orphaned, as well as, quote, a long-range plan for the rehabilitation of the children who are wards from the north or neglected and illegitimate." As the early social welfare professionals in Saskatchewan stated, often these quote unquote neglected Métis children were not so much in need of protection from neglectful parents as suffering from the issues of poverty and marginalization. One of the concerns was re-education, termed retraining in the annual reports of social welfare and rehabilitation. It stated, "In certain areas of the province, neglect among this group is very serious, neglect arising from inadequate school facilities and improper housing. When it has become necessary to apprehend the children, the problem of proper placement is difficult due to prejudice and the difficulty that the children have in adjusting themselves to a new environment." In cooperation with the Department of Municipal Affairs, a survey was made of the children in Green Lake area, and as a result of the survey, plans were instituted to build a shelter, which an attempt will be made to specifically train these children. At the shelter, children had access to medical and nursing care and attended a nearby school operated by the Department of Education. The non-denominational shelter opened on the 5th of February, 1947. Non-Indigenous child welfare experts from the southern part of the province staffed the shelter. Alice Dales, a child welfare consultant and social worker in the province, reflected that, quote, "the decision was made based on the assumption it would be easier for the children if they were left in surroundings familiar to them. Because of their ethnic origin, it was thought it would be difficult for them to move out and integrate into the white outside world. The social worker rationalized that Métis children required an institutional setting in Green Lake rather than direct placement into foster homes because moving children from their surroundings would have been too abrupt. She stated, most of them slept in beds for the first time and enjoyed foods and clothes unknown to them in the world they'd formerly lived in. It was surprising how quickly these children were able to adapt themselves to the standards of their white cousins and how much pride and pleasure they took in the finer things of life. Part of the rationale for the government was that Métis children needed to be trained in Euro-Canadian hygienic standards prior to being fit for adoption into white middle-class family homes. Addressing the Regional Conference on Social Welfare, in 1946, Tommy Douglas articulated his vision for Saskatchewan in charting a new course for government-administered welfare services. He stated, in terms of technological progress, we will measure our success by what society does for the underprivileged, the subnormal, the widow, for the aged and the unwanted child, and recognize her responsibility for the weak in society. Canada will, in this way, take her place among the great nations of the world. Through rehabilitating families to take their proper place in the modernizing province, the CCF envisions social work professionals providing expert therapeutic services on a case-by-case basis for the, quote, weak in society. The recently reorganized Department of Social Welfare would be on the vanguard of social welfare and child welfare practice as the state moved in to ensure families carried out their responsibilities toward their younger members and offered therapeutic support for mothers without breadwinners. The gendered nature of child welfare legislation has been identified by feminist historians to penalize mothers and fathers who are unable or unwilling to provide for offspring. As Veronica Strongbow has argued, quote, the rights of those who were judged to be inadequate family men were to be limited by the male-led government that would better protect the nation's human resources, end quote. Métis men who had been provided the opportunity to be rehabilitated into proper role of breadwinner and agriculturalists were deemed to have failed to embrace the state-based opportunity by 1962, when rehabilitation efforts floundered and the CCF government formally ended support for Métis colonies. The failed Métis rehabilitation experiment of segregation and rehabilitation were replaced within 1961 with a policy aimed at removing Métis children for integration through child welfare system. Official reports of illegitimacy and common law relationships among the Métis required the intervention of social workers who had become the nation's leading experts on the so-called, quote, problem of the unwed mother, while offering solutions to the dilemma of Aboriginal integration. Métis children entered the child welfare system by apprehension due to neglect, identification through unmarried parents legislation, and legal adoption. By 1965, social work professionals in Saskatchewan decried the overrepresentation of Indigenous children, and in 1967, piloted the Adopt Indian and Métis project to find white adoptive homes. Through child welfare legislation and the provision of child welfare services such as fostering and transracial adoption, Saskatchewan's child welfare system incorporated the Métis children of its failed rehabilitation attempts, as well as other Indigenous children in all manner of families who did not fit the Euro-Canadian norm. Advertising campaigns such as the Adopt Indian and Métis project that I look at in my book provides a gloss of benevolence to this process and obscures the impact of racialized poverty and loss of land. This process I have termed advertising for ignorance. Instead, the CCF government strove to demonstrate an image of cultural superiority and benevolent generosity. Indeed, as the case of Robert Doucette illustrates, child welfare legislation was also used coercively to punish Métis mothers and re-socialize Métis children away from lands, kinship ties, and Métis cultures. This process cannot be understood without reference to the Green Lake Children's Shelter experiment and the failed Métis colonies and the expert knowledges that these early policies generated. I want to close with another passage from my interview with Robert Doucette. I had naively asked, why is the adoption of Aboriginal children in non-Aboriginal homes problematic for Aboriginal leaders? He replied at this time, as he was the president of the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. He said, I don't think it is so much problematic for leaders so much as it is for the kids. And that's not to say non-Aboriginal homes aren't loving homes or don't teach really good values to kids. When you see what has happened to a lot of the people, what has happened because of the residential schools and foster homes, I think you can come to the conclusion that there has to be a better way of dealing with kids in the foster care system. There has to be. Like, why didn't they, when my grandfather came asking for me, why didn't they tell him where I was? What were they afraid of? For God's sake, my cousin was living next door to me on 3rd Street East Flat, the next house. Why? Why is there such resistance to having those kinship ties? And telling people, you know what, Robert, you're a foster kid, and here's where you're from. I think even if you tell the kid it's not a very good place, they'll understand. Maybe not the younger kids. I think adults don't give enough credit to kids for the capacity to understand. What's wrong with telling me, Robert, you're the 8th generation of the Métis clan from Buffalo Narrows. Here's who your relations are. I'd understand on maybe the woman's side or the man's side, they don't want you to know. I understand still. I think it's important for families and individuals to know, to have the guaranteed right to know where you're from, and when you want your file, there's no bureaucracy, no legislation that says you can't have it. Aboriginal leaders have to deal with their communities, their people, and their nation. But at the end of the day, it's always the individual that's in the situation. They have to deal with what's going on. Robert's revelation about his lived experience of the colonization of Métis kinship and severance of connections to Wahkotwin illuminates the fundamental logics of the child welfare removal system, the rupture of Métis knowledges and land-based identities. The long 60s scoop began in the early years of CCF experiments in rehabilitation and relocation. Then, in abandoning the colonies, efforts shifted to the tried and true colonial strategy of child removal, this time cloaked in the colorblind common sense of the child welfare system, then fostering an adoption, which we now know as the 60s scoop. Marcy. That concludes my talk for today.
Thank you very much, Allyson, for this presentation and for this very important chapter of Métis history. So at this point, we're going to take some questions coming from the people that are watching us. And Amanda will be the person relaying the questions.
Thank you, Allyson. That was wonderful. Our first question comes from Paul, and he is wondering, was it always the idea for the CCF to move towards the AIM program? He also says, thank you for the amazing presentation, and he can't wait for the book.
It wasn't under the CCF that the AIM program was introduced. It was under the Ross Thatcher Liberal government in 1967. So the CCF actually was out of power at that point. It was the Liberal government that introduced the AIM program. But it was, so for sort of to bridge that gap, just for the clarification there, it was under the CCF that increasing children were incorporated into the child welfare system as individuals cared for in foster homes. So that's where that kind of CCF bridge is, which eventually led to the Adopt Indian and Métis program under the Liberal government, which was sort of furthered that individualizing ethos that was kind of initiated in this period here.
Any other questions from the audience? Nothing yet. Nathalie, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, what is the percentage of children that ended up in foster care in Saskatchewan?
So it has continually increased from the period we're looking at, the early 1960s up until now. Now it's over 80% of children. At the time, in the mid 1960s, by the time the AIM program was instituted, it was roughly about 40%. At that time, they were considered problematically overrepresented at 40%, and by the kind of late period, the late 1970s, it was closer to 70%. So it's sort of it's escalated from the 1960s on. The first mention of race was in 1959.
And where are we now in Saskatchewan when it comes to the government working with Métis communities?
Yeah, so that's been an ongoing process, that working out that. I think it's emerging, but it certainly isn't as far along as, say, Manitoba and other places. But certainly it's been on the radar of Métis governments from the 1970s onward. It's just I think in Saskatchewan there's a lot of complexities and resistance from the government's perspective, I would say, to relinquishing the control of child welfare to Indigenous governments and resolving some of these longstanding issues.
So do you have the impression that some of the framework agreements that were signed between the different Métis nations would help in order to maybe have policies that are like oriented towards, helping the Métis children and reconnecting with communities?
I think that will dramatically change the way in which child welfare will be administered and policies will be formed in Saskatchewan. I think it would restore responsibility and control back to Métis communities and Métis governments. Something that they've been, that's another kind of focus of my research, is the way on which Métis governments have been agitating and demanding that the restoration of that kinship, that system of kinship. Mm-hmm.
Any other questions, Amanda?
Not yet.
Maybe, I don't know if David or Darren would have some questions.
Hi, Allyson. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Darren. Now
I'd like to know more about Ross Thatcher's policies.
Okay.
I find him interesting because if I had to compare him to anyone in the political scene in North America, he would have been the equivalent of a Dixiecrat. He was a liberal in name, but he was so far to the right politically that any liberal in Canada at the time, he wouldn't have been near them politically. But he was interesting in the sense that while he was very paternalistic, he would call out what he thought was the racism in Saskatchewan. For instance, he referred to Saskatchewan as Mississippi North for its treatment of Indigenous people. And I don't know of any right of center politicians in contemporary Canada that would acknowledge the racism that exists towards Indigenous people, but he did. But how much more paternalistic would you say his policies were than, say, the CCF and NDP in regards to the adopting of Indigenous children? Would you say more so or less, given that rhetoric of anti-racism?
Right. I guess he would be a product of, in some ways, of his time and of his ideology. He was very much, he formed the Indian and Métis department, the first of its kind as a provincial department. And so he like, I feel like Tommy Douglas, he had a different approach, but something that was, he wanted to address what he saw as poverty in Métis and First Nations communities. So he approached it from his, like, as you say, a very right, sort of what we call a neoliberalist now, I guess, more so like very much an individualist approach. So the Indian and Métis department wanted to get people working, essentially, find jobs for First Nations, find jobs for Métis people, kind of create these like adult education programs so people could get into the workforce. And so that very much, it wasn't so much let's address the group kind of dynamics or the issues of land as a collective. He was very much an individualist that saw this kind of resolving poverty as a kind of pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of approach where you just kind of get to work. And so in terms of the child welfare system, I feel that the Adopt Indian and Métis program kind of, it has sort of echoes of that same type of ethos, which is we just got to get these kids in happy homes. We don't need to worry about so much the you know, where they came from, or where their, you know, what their communities are like if they can just get in a white middle class happy home and have a good life, then we'll solve this problem of all these kids piling up in the child welfare system. So that was, it's kind of like in sort of ways, like, what are the numbers telling me? Like, get the numbers of people working, show me the numbers of kids in these homes. And so we kind of see some progress in terms of resolving some of these issues of super complex issues in Saskatchewan, rooted in the history, etc. He just wanted to deal with it on an individual basis. So that's kind of where we see I argue that the development of this Adopt Indian and Métis project is rooted in this kind of individualistic, kind of ahistorical, in a sense, kind of approach that I think he had. Was just me. I don't know where it came from. I don't know Ross. I haven't spent a lot of time studying Ross Thatcher and his biographically, or sort of emotionally, where he came from, but certainly he felt that children going into these homes wouldn't face racism, or he didn't think racism would be something that they would have to, the families or the children would have to confront. So in that sense, that he was maybe naive about racism in Saskatchewan in some ways, but yeah, that's what I would say about Ross Thatcher.
Yeah, I noticed in some of the research I was doing recently, they referred to him as being influenced by Barry Goldwater. So that tells me he was very much probably of a libertarian mindset you alluded to. So that could explain a lot of his thinking. But anyway, he is an interesting contrast to Tommy Douglas.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Hannah. She says, "Hi, Allyson. Can you expand more on what you said? The first reference of race was in 1959.
Yeah.
Who or how was that stated?"
So when I was doing my research, one of the first, my archival research, as it was a history degree I was doing, I spent a lot of times in the Saskatchewan archives. And one of the first places I looked in was the annual reports of the Department of, it started at Social Welfare and Rehabilitation. It changed names a number of times. So I would read the annual reports, and it would give me a sense of what the Ministry of Social Welfare was essentially what their programs were, the kind of projects they were undertaking, like the Green Lake Children's Shelter, for example. And so it was in those annual reports that I was referring to. They started keeping track of the numbers of children that were coming into the child welfare system based on race. So whether they were First Nations, Métis, or non-Indigenous, as we would call it now. And so that's, to me, that's a really important signal that they're certainly perceiving that at the departmental bureaucratic level, that there's categories being created. So it's at that time that it started being, it was noted the race of children being apprehended or coming into the care. So yeah, that's what I meant by that.
Okay, we have time for one more question if anybody has anything. Okay, we're going to segue over to Darren, who's going to say a little bit about the Gabriel Dumont Institute and what you guys do.
Well, first of all, thank you, everybody. This is a wonderful event. Thank you, Allyson. Thank you, Nathalie. Thank you, Amanda. Gabriel Dumont Institute is very happy to partner with the Rupertsland Centre to present this particular discussion, and I'm very, very hopeful that there'll be more of these in the future, more collaboration between our two institutions. I guess I'll start by mentioning a bit about Gabriel Dumont Institute. We are a Métis cultural and educational institution in Saskatchewan. We started our operations in 1980. We run the gamut of programming relating to Métis. We are a Métis educator. We have the Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program. We have the Dumont Technical Institute, which offers technical and vocational and training, upgrading programming in Saskatchewan. We have Gabriel Dumont Institute Training and Employment, which provides Métis applicants with a series of funding to allow them to enter the job market. We also have a very thorough scholarship program that's administered through the Institute. Where I work and where David works, whom I'll introduce shortly, is a very interesting place. We work in the Gabriel Dumont Institute Métis Department of Culture and Heritage. We're also part of the Gabriel Dumont Institute Press. We've had several iterations since 1980. We used to be called the Curriculum Department, then we became the Publishing Department. We are a bit of a catch-all in terms of cultural development for the Institute because we are a Métis museum, we're a Métis archives, we are a Métis depository of information, we're a book publisher, we have an online presence through the Virtual Museum of Métis History and Culture. We have an active Michif program, which Dave is one of the key people involved in. So we do a little bit of everything within our department. And it's been a privilege for me to work in the Institute since 1996. I guess I'm a lifer. And Dave will probably say the same thing too. He's been around the Institute since 2002, I believe. So between the two of us, I think we're approaching about 45 years of experience at Gabriel Dumont Institute. And it's just been a wonderful experience for me personally, professionally, and for the wealth of information I've learned. Other things that the Institute has is we have a very thorough library system based in Regina, but with programming in Prince Albert and in Saskatoon. And we're the largest employer of Métis people in the province of Saskatchewan. We're community owned and operated. We're owned by the Métis people of Saskatchewan. We were founded by Métis community people in 1976. That's when our origins began, but it was through their hard work and through their activism that led to the creation of the Gabriel Dumont Institute. As a result, we are very much guided by our community members. Our Board of Governors are chosen by the 12 regions of the Métis Nation, Saskatchewan. They work in consultation with our Board of Directors, our management team, and together they develop policy for the Institute. We have an annual assembly every year in which the membership for the Métis community help develop policy and guide the direction of the Institute. We were very fortunate last year, David and myself and Karen and the rest of the department, to move into the main office. They built a new center for us, which houses our Métis gallery, our Métis archives, our rare book room. And when the pandemic's over, we welcome everybody to come back and have a look. It's quite a remarkable place. It's a very welcoming place. It's been a boon for us in the Institute, and we hope once everything normalizes, the community can use it again, because it was a gathering place for all sorts of Métis cultural workshops, all sorts of community events, book launches, and that sort of thing. So we invite you all to come to our new center once the pandemic ends at 917 22nd Street West in Saskatoon. I'm going to discuss a bit about David Morin and then discuss our program, and I'll let Dave take over. David, as I said earlier, has been with the Institute since 2002. He's a Michif with origins in St. Adolphe, Manitoba, which is south of Winnipeg, but he grew up in and around Nipawin. He's also one of our graduates from one of our programs, the Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program. And we were lucky to get Dave almost right out of university. He did some teaching in rural Saskatchewan, became right to the Institute right away out of university. He's an expert at a lot of things. He's our go-to guy when it comes to technology. He does all the layout for our books. He's an integral component to the publishing program. Without Dave, we couldn't make our books. We all complement each other, but Dave is really one of the linchpins in putting the books together. So if you see a Gabriel Dumont Institute book out there, Institute Press book, that's David Morin's book. He put it together. So kudos to him for that. Another area where Dave has really taken a leadership role at the Institute is the Michif program. He works with our elders and our knowledge keepers. He was responsible for developing the Michif language apps for both the Northern Michif and the Southern Michif, or Heritage Michif, working closely with Vincent Henneque and Norman Fleury and others. and Dave will get into that further. Amongst other things, Dave's a fan of the Rough Riders, of course, and a fan of the Winnipeg Jets. And if you can see behind him, he really likes comic books. He's a swell guy to work with, and I leave it to my colleague and friend David Morin to take over from here.
Thanks, Darren. Those are very kind words, and flattered, and just a pleasure working with you. So, and I can repeat all those things about how great you are to work with. So thanks, Darren. As Darren said, a lot of the work I do is with Michif. Thanks to any Michif speakers who are watching over on YouTube or Facebook. Appreciate your support. I don't speak Michif myself. I'm more of a technician, and have had the pleasure to work with many Michif speakers, like Darren was saying, Norman Fleury, Vince Hennique, Harriet St. Pierre, Irma Taylor, Margaret Hodgson, the late Rita Flamond, Jean Peltier, the list goes on. Yeah, so today what we've been invited here to talk about is Michif language revitalization. So I'm gonna pop up a PowerPoint here and we'll go through it. So I'd like to start, Darren did a great job talking about GDI, and I just wanted to share our mission statement. It's to promote the renewal and development of Métis culture through research, materials development, collection, and distribution of those materials, and the design, development, and delivery of Métis-specific educational programs and services. So what Darren and I do, and Karen and Amy and George and Ryan, we do a lot of that first part of the mission statement, working on the research, the materials development, and promoting Métis culture through things like MÉTIS Talks today. So when we talk about Michif and communication in general, communication is what makes societies work. It helps us tell our ideas, tell our discoveries, share our research, like Allyson's 60 Scoop research. It helps us talk about what we want and what we need and what we're thinking about. And it also forms the cultures and worldviews that we see. So a Michif speaker, with the language, what it means, it's going to be different than what an English speaker thinks, or a French speaker thinks, or a Spanish speaker thinks. And that's what's so important about language and keeping these languages intact. So 457 living languages on Earth today have fewer than 10 speakers. And there's already 639 known languages that are already extinct. So that's 639 worldviews that we can't experience or learn through. And then in 2016, the census listed only 640 people as having Michif as their primary or secondary language. We've heard of less, we've heard of more, but it's around that number. Now, for those of you who don't know what Michif is in the first place, it's the language of the Métis. In general, it combines Cree verbs, French nouns, and their associated syntax and grammar. And it emerged in the 1700s. We're talking fur trade times. Métis were middlemen, and many spoke many languages other than Cree, French. Some spoke Soto, Dene, many indigenous languages. So in Saskatchewan, we have what we call heritage Michif, which is that the Michif that's like 50% Cree, 50% French merged together. And then in northern Michif, spoken in the north, like Isla Crosse, Buffalo Narrows, it's predominantly Cree with a little bit of French. And then there's also the Michif French that's in like St. Laurent, Manitoba, Batoche area. and that's predominantly French with a little bit of Cree. Now, when we talk about what are critically endangered languages, well, UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, they've identified that 75% of the 90 different Indigenous languages in Canada are endangered. And they also have 4 levels of language viability. So when they're looking at languages, they look at these different categories. So the first is unsafe. So the children still can speak the language, but only in specific times and instances, and aren't using it like fluently every day. And then you have definitely endangered. So this is when the parents still speak, but the children respond in a different language. So for example, my parents spoke French and I would respond in English because I didn't speak French. No, in petit peu. And then you've got severely endangered. So this is when the grandparents can speak the language, but the parents understand it, but then they don't pass it on to their children. And then we have critically endangered. So this is when the youngest speakers are the grandparents, the great grandparents, and it's infrequently spoken. And for example, like with Michif, one of the youngest fluent speakers is Norman Fleury at 71 years old. We did a project back in, I think, 2009 called our Michif Resource Guide. And we had brought together Michif speakers from across Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And we honored them with sharing quotes in a resource along with dictionaries in Michif, Northern Michif, and French Michif. And almost half of those speakers are no longer with us. And that's what we mean when we're talking about critically endangered and the importance of working with Michif to promote, preserve, and revitalize. So when I've given this presentation before, I've talked about language loss, and the elders told me that the language wasn't lost, it was taken. And I took that to heart, and it's very true. So we wanted to reiterate that language loss isn't our fault that it's happened, that I don't speak Michif. It was taken. So when we talk about loss and taken, some of the factors that are kind of just kind of happen over time is a speaker might marry a non-speaker, and then they find themselves only speaking the language of their significant other. The language might not have been passed on to children. So it might have seemed like, oh, we have to teach our child English and only English so that they could succeed in today's world. So that Indigenous language was seen as a hindrance instead of a gift. People are forced to speak dominant language at work. So you might not be able to speak in Michif because no one else in your workplace speaks Michif. Mass media is not in your language, so you can't constantly be exposed to the words and the language. Pressure from peers. So you might try to speak Michif and then someone will say, don't speak that, English is the way to go. And so you feel that peer pressure and then stop speaking altogether. And then sometimes there's ambivalence towards the language or lack of motivation. And it's been studied when we're looking at language that change cannot come from outside the language community. It has to come from the community. That motivation has to be brought there and to get the language revitalized. And when we talk about language being taken, there's also intentional extinction of language. There's, the Beothuk in the Maritimes being wiped out. There goes their language and their worldviews. Residential schools, Indigenous children were forced to not speak their language, suffering physical abuse at times when they wanted to speak their language. The 60s scoop that we just learned about, that had a huge effect on language loss. When you take an Indigenous child away from their home where they may have been exposed to Indigenous languages, now they're taken into a different home where their dominant language is something other than Michif or Cree, and forced to speak that family's language. So now I'm going to shift over to talking about the Indigenous Languages Act that recently was passed into law. So in 2017, 2018, we met with many elders, stakeholders across the Métis homeland, people from Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all brought together to discuss what needs to be done to promote, preserve, and revitalize Indigenous languages, and Michif in particular. And when the Indigenous Languages Act was being developed, the Government of Canada chose to co-develop this act with the Métis Nation, the Assembly of First Nation, and the Inuit. So everyone got to contribute to this, and everyone held their own engagements. For the Michif engagement, it was led by Gabriel Dumont Institute and Louis Royal Institute in a partnership for the Métis Nation. So what we heard was that revitalization is vital to our well-being as Métis and Michif people. And it's important in maintaining our distinct culture. These elders recognized the importance of GDI and LRI and wanted to see our organization strengthened. They recognized the work that we have done in Michif and wanted that to continue. They also stressed the importance of multi-year funding. The way things work and worked in the past is you're applying for grants all the time to do these activities. And you never knew if this thing was going to be able to happen, if the funds would be there next year or even next month. So having that commitment to multi-year funding was important to our elders. They also saw mentorship between Michif speakers and youth to be important. So making partnerships in schools and other organizations to bring together our Michif speakers and youth in different settings. And they wanted to build speech communities where the language could be used every day. So ideas came up like having almost like a party line that Michif speakers could call into and be able to speak with people, because so many Michif speakers live so far away from each other that it's hard to use the language. So they discussed building these communities to bring them together over distances. Another thing they discussed was mentor apprentice program. So this is if a learner actually goes and lives with a Michif speaker and all they hear is Michif. So you're doing all your activities, your daily activities, work, cooking, everything in Michif, and learning like you would when you were growing up. They also saw the importance of gatherings. Like I said, they were a lot of our speakers are far apart. So gatherings were important to be able to speak the language together. I hear so many times when they say, oh, I remember that word, or, oh, I forgot that word, thank you. And so it helps jog memories of the language. It instills a sense of pride and helps overcome discrimination when you are proud of your language. And they thought if we work on teaching Michif in schools, it needs to continue speaking in the home. Right now, there's a Michif and pre-kindergarten program running in 5 schools in Saskatchewan, Isla Cross, 2 in Saskatoon, and 2 in Regina, working with those 4 and 5-year-olds. So being able to take those 5-year-olds and have their parents learn Michif at home as well would help to carry that on. More dances. I just talked to Jean Peltier the other day, and she thought that being able to have dances and make Michif calls for square dancing and using the languages in that social setting would help to promote and revitalize. Incorporating Michif into meetings. So we heard that, you know, in 5 years' time, we want to be able to hold meetings directly in Michif, or at least incorporate Michif into those meetings that we hold. And then they thought Cookum and Mushum days at school would be fun, you know, another way to promote and preserve and revitalize the language. They want Michif available in print, audio, and video, in dictionaries, storybooks, recipe books, games, comic books, songs. And LRI and GDI, we do a lot of this, but it's never enough, right? We always want more resources. And so that's what they want. They want to see those resources continue to be made. And they also wanted to see the resources that do exist distributed, so that, you know, not everyone knows about GDI or LRI. So being able to get these resources out to the communities so that they recognize that they exist would help to revitalize the language. They also talked about land-based learning. So this is, again, kind of like the Master Mentor Apprentice program, where elders are thinking about land in Michif first. So being able to talk about the land in Michif shares that worldview. They also talked about a resource information center. So a gathering place of all these resources would be helpful. GDI has a lot of our Michif resources on métismuseum.ca. There's a Michif tools link up at the top bar that contains many things. A lot of our dictionaries, lesson plans, elder interviews, lots of stuff there. And they also talked about scholarships for students studying Michif. So when you think back to the mentor apprenticeship program, we're talking about living together for 3, 4, 6 months. Not a lot of people can just take 6 months off work to become a Michif language keeper. And so a scholarship that would help with living expenses would be important. And then when we talk about promoting the language, so signage in Michif, distributing Michif materials at our events like Back to Batoche and other festivals, and advocacy for Michif. So tell your library, tell your school that you want Michif resources in those places. And using social media to promote the language. If you follow us on Twitter, we often have our Michif phrase of the day. So we do that a few times a week to help share the language. So 2019, after all that language engagement, Indigenous Languages Act was passed in June 2019. So what that Language Act has done is it established long-term sustainable funding. It supports the reclamation, revitalization, maintaining, and strengthening of Indigenous languages in Canada. It's supporting and promoting the use of Indigenous languages, and that the Government of Canada will work with provinces, territories, Indigenous representatives, organizations, Indigenous governments to create effective support for Indigenous languages in Canada, and also to establish an Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages. So that's all well and good. Now we need to see how this is going to take effect, because that's still being worked on through Métis Nation, the Métis National Council, Assembly of First Nations, and the Inuit Taperet Kanatami. So right now they're still doing engagement sessions. The current one that's going on till the end of November here is focusing on what the commissioner role is going to look like, what the directors are going to look like, and then how the funding is going to work. So right now, for the first 5 years, $333.7 million has been allocated to carry out those key takeaways. And then after that, 115.7 million per year focused on Indigenous languages. So right now the work's still being done on how is that 115 million, how is that 333 million going to be used? How much goes towards the commissioner? How much goes towards specific projects? How much goes to funding different ideas and projects? So that's still kind of up for grabs. We had a language engagement just last month in October with Métis Nation, the Métis National Council, where we had over 200 people engaged in a Zoom meeting like this, talking about their ideas for these points. So that's what the priority is right now. And then shortly after the engagement, the appointment of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages will be happening, and the appointment of directors. There's been talk for the directors of having 3 directors to represent each of the Métis, First Nations, and Inuit. And yeah, that's a quick overview of Michif and Michif language revitalization. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Amanda will help bring them to us. So thank you, Marcy.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, David. Our first question comes from Regan, and they ask, as Michif is an oral language, there appear to be orthographic differences between regions/learning groups. Do you know if there are any efforts to standardize spelling for learning materials?
So there isn't yet. With all the resources that GDI does, what we do is we create an orthography that's consistent within the document. So when we work with Norman Fleury, we're using his orthography. Like you said, Michif is an oral language, so it wasn't written down before. When we work with Harriet St. Pierre, she writes it a little differently. So all of that writing is consistent within that project. But yeah, it's hard because, like you said, there's a lot of differences in the Michif that people speak to nail it down into one way. I know the Inuit are working on a standard orthography for their languages, and yeah, it's important for sure.
Okay. Our second question comes from Peter, who asks, is Michif the Métis language or a Métis language? In Alberta, there are many Métis communities that speak Cree and can carry on conversation in Cree no problem. At times, has felt like Métis political and cultural organization want Michif to be the Métis language versus one of the Indigenous languages Métis people speak.
So I totally understand where you're coming from, and we do hear that. Michif is a language that originated with the Métis. So I guess that's why a focus is put on Michif as a Métis language. But yeah, many Métis people speak Indigenous languages, Saulteaux, Cree, Dene, and those are all important to preserve and promote and revitalize as well. And First Nations are working on those things. So, you have places like the Saskatchewan Cultural Centre, Indigenous Cultural Centre, that creates resources for those other languages. So there's avenues for Cree resources. And that's why I guess we focus on Michif, is because the First Nations, they're not going to work on a Michif resource because that's not their language. So that's why we work on it for us. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? None. I've got a question. You were talking about Michif party lines as being a way that Michif speakers can get together and speak with each other, right, conversationally. I was wondering if there's any kind of like other like online communities that facilitate that kind of immersion.
I have looked into it a little bit. There's a neat app called Live Mocha, and it brings speakers together. So there are things you could do, but remember what I said, our youngest Michif speakers are like 70 years old and up. So technology can be a real big barrier for a lot of speakers. They may not feel comfortable doing a Zoom meeting like this, right? But if they have technicians that can help set them up, awesome, great. The party line idea was just a less, I guess, technological barrier, because everybody has phones and have been using them for a long time. And yeah, but I mean, something like this would be wonderful, of course, to bring Michif speakers together.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question comes from Nor B, who asks, with homeschooling on the rise, what resources do you provide to families at home, and how can we access these speakers when we're learning the language at home?
So something you could do as from home is go to métismuseum.ca. The Michif tools that we have there's one section that's called Michif Lessons. And you can also download we have app versions of these. So if you look in your Google Play Store or your Apple App Store, search Michif, and our apps are pretty much the only ones that pop up. So there's Michif to Go, which has a dictionary of 11,500 words and another 500 phrases that you can learn. So it has the text, it has the audio, because Michif is an oral language and the orthography isn't standardized. We find it really important to include that audio so that you can hear the language. So all those phrases, all those words are in there. You can hear them, you can practice them. There's the Northern Michif to Go, which again has our northern communities like Isle Cross, the predominantly Cree with a little bit of French. So that app is available. And the Michif Lessons. The Michif Lessons has about 60 different activities that you can do. So things like animals, it'll have a list of animals and a bunch of little clip arts that you can drag the Michif word to see if it's the right Michif word. So yeah, 60-ish lessons that you can do with your children there. And it'll give you a nice score of bronze, silver, or gold, so you can strive for that gold and retake the lessons over and over till you get there. Yeah, so that's a few of the things that we have. You could also take out our books from your local library or order through us. They all come with narration CDs, so you'll hear the Michif speaker telling the story in that language. So yeah, Louis Riel Institute, they have some other activities online when you go to their website. So there's some things that can help for sure.
Okay. I have another question from Regan. Asks, since paper resources lack broad context orthography, how much of the GDI effort for language revitalization is focused on collecting multiple sources of recordings?
Yeah, quite a bit, really. We have done a lot of language banking. We will do more. So, for example, a couple years back, we held a gathering out at Windy Acres, John Arcan's acreage, with Michif speakers from Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and they talked in their Michif ways about different topics like spirituality, toys and games, things that they grew up with, celebrations, working, jobs. So all of those topics have been captured in Michif. And we have the audio, we have some video of that, and we're working on translating, because it was completely done in Michif. We've done work to translate it into English so that we can put subtitles with it. But this is work that's ongoing. So yeah, we're doing a lot. We're interviewing lots of Michif speakers and hearing their voices in their words.
That's amazing. Next question is from 1800 Beaudry. Asks, is there any initiatives to create media or learning games that teach Michif for educators?
Not that I'm aware of, other than the apps that we've created. There is a website that was done by Rita Flamand. I could put up a link if you're interested. I could comment on the Facebook page later. And it was it's an interactive little website that has Rita Flamand at her home in Caperville. And you click on different parts of the home, and she's sitting kind of augmented reality style on like a drawn chair, and she's got a picture beside her, and you click on the portrait and it says "Le Portrait." And then you travel to the school and you learn a few words there. So it's a fun little interactive website. Yeah.
No more questions from the YouTube so far. Does anybody else have any questions for David? Okay.
Well, thank you everyone who tuned in today. Really appreciate it, and hope you learned something from Allyson and I and Marcy.
Thank you, David. We really appreciate it. Nathalie, did you want to say some closing words?
Sure. So Marcy to, of course, Allyson and David for their wonderful presentations, and also the fact that we can see the connection also between the 60s group, and also the fact that when it comes to the Michif language and the importance of the revitalization of the Michif language. So I really appreciated both of these presentations. And also Marcy to the Gabriel Dumont Institute for accepting our invitation. And I hope that in the future, as Darren said earlier, we will be able to do more together. I think it's important also to try to get over those boundaries or fake boundaries that exist between the different provinces. But I think we're on the way to be able to maybe do a few activities together. And Marcy to all the people that tuned in and watch the video. Of course, you'll be able to watch it again if you feel like it, or if you missed it, you'll be able to watch it on our Facebook page or website, and the same for, I think so, for GDI. So we'll hopefully see you again in our next Métis Talks, which will happen in the spring 2021. And Well, we still hope that maybe the next time it will be in person instead of doing it on video, but who knows? So goodbye to everybody, and also stay safe, all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.